Same-day sourdough is perfect when you want fresh bread on the table for dinner time, but you didn't plan ahead at all. You can have fresh bread in just 12 hours or less, including the time it takes to feed your starter and waiting for it to peak. The first time-saving thing we're doing is a 1:1:1 feeding ratio to feed our starter. The more starter you have in the mix, the faster it will ferment, and that's true for feeding your starter and making dough. We're also using warm water to feed our starter because temperature is also really important. Higher temperatures mean things will progress more quickly, which is what we want for this same-day bread. Colder temperatures, everything's going to take a lot longer. So for this recipe, we're basically throwing all of our tricks at this dough and our starter to make sure that things go as quickly as possible. And that includes using warm water, keeping our starter in a warm place, and using a lot of starter in our mix. Normally, I do a 1:5:5 feeding ratio, which means for every 1 part starter, there's 5 times as much flour and water. But for this, we are doing everything equal, and that's going to make things really go fast. Ideally, our starter is peaked and ready to use in the dough within 4 to 6 hours. Also, shout out to this little tool. It's from Tovolo. I love using it to feed my starter and scrape the sides of the jar clean. So we've fed our starter. This is what we're going to use to make our dough, hopefully in 4 to 6 hours. We're looking for this to double, ideally triple in size at peak, and there will be lots of bubbles everywhere. I'll show you what that looks like. I also get a lot of questions about what do you do with your discard? How do you kind of manage your feeding? So I wanted to show this part here. That little plastic deli container is my discard jar that I keep in the fridge. I put any extra starter that I'm not using in that discard jar, and I'll use it later on in recipes. Let's mix our dough. It's been 4 to 6 hours. My starter is ready. So we need 290 grams of warm water and 250 grams of our active, bubbly, happy starter. You might be thinking, oh my gosh, 250 grams, that is so much starter. I never use that much starter for 1 loaf of bread, and this is intentional. Remember, the more starter that you have, the faster things will go, and we want things to be quick. So we are actually using 50% starter in relation to the flour in baker's percentages. So we're adding 500 grams of bread flour and 10 grams of sea salt. I just kind of mix everything together here at the beginning. If you wanted, you could do what's called a fermentation, where you delay the salt. So you would mix the flour, starter, and water together, but save the salt and add that 30 minutes later separately, and that will speed things up even more. But my guess was if you're doing a same-day sourdough loaf, you want things to be quick and easy, so I wanted to keep this as simple as possible. Keep this in a warm place, ideally 78 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Let the dough relax for about 30 minutes in this warm, toasty space, and then we're coming back for our first round of stretch and folds. This is very simple. You're just lifting up an edge of the dough and folding it back on top of itself, and you're going around the bowl in like little quarter turns until the dough resists you. A lot of recipes say to just do this 4 times. I like to do it like 8 to 10 times usually because I'm trying to fully develop the gluten as much as possible. This is the second round of stretch and folds. 30 minutes had passed, and we're going to come back for the third round of stretch and folds after this, again 30 minutes later. If you can really keep your dough between 78 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, it might be a little bit of a struggle to make sure you get all of your stretch and folds done before the bulk fermentation is finished. It only takes about 4 to 5 hours if you can keep your dough this warm, and it might be even a little bit quicker depending on how strong your starter is because we used so much starter. I took a minute to just touch the dough and kind of show you how it reacted and what it looked like when the bulk fermentation was finished, just as a visual reference so you can compare this to your dough. I prefer misting my surfaces with water instead of using flour to make them non-stick. It just makes things easier when you go to shape your dough. Sometimes the flour can prevent the dough from sticking to itself, and that can make shaping a little bit frustrating. I'm waiting for our big blob of dough to come out of my glass bowl, just tilting it, sometimes using my finger to scrape off the bits from the side of the bowl to release it. And then it's time for the pre-shaping. So again, I'm misting anything that comes into contact with the dough with some water to make it non-stick. The goal of the pre-shaping here is to get the dough to come into a round, smooth ball with a good bit of surface tension on top. And the way that we do that is using our bench scraper or our hands in this kind of candy cane motion where we're pushing the dough ball up and then pulling it back towards ourselves. We're using the surface. Mine is a wood surface. Maybe you have granite or quartz. We're using that to kind of cling onto the bottom of the dough and create that tension. Again, I'm just poking it so you can see how the dough is reacting to compare it to yours. Now it's time for the final shaping. The dough just sat on the counter for about 30 minutes, uncovered, just hanging out there, and I'm coming back to do what's called the caddy clasp. This is a very simple final shaping technique, and that's why I like it so much. You just fold the dough like a book and kind of pinch the seam together in the middle, and then you'll just pick it up from that seam and stick it down in your banneton. If you notice that your dough feels kind of loose, mine did, you can pull on the edges and do what's called stitching. This is kind of an extreme example of stitching. Normally my dough is a little bit more taut than this, but this just ensures that what ends up being the top of the dough is very taut, which is what we want. That's going to help with really good oven spring later on when we go to bake our loaf. Now, what's really unique about this same day loaf is we are skipping the cold proof, which it does sacrifice flavor, but what you gain is a faster loaf on your table, which is the goal of this specific recipe. Instead of doing our second proof in the fridge overnight, we are doing it on our counter, and it only takes about 1 to 2 hours if you can keep your dough in that warm place. To make sure it's ready for baking, you can do what's called the poke test. Poke the dough about a 1/2 inch. If it springs back slowly and a little bit of indentation remains, it's ready for baking. I'm putting my loaf directly in this preheated bread dome and not scoring it first, which is kind of odd, but because this dough is so warm, it's kind of hard to score. The blade just drags a little bit. So I'm doing what's called a 7-minute score. So you bake the dough for 7 minutes and then score it and put it back in for the rest of its covered bake time. And as you can see, the dough is a lot more firm and it's just easier to score. That's optional. You can score it first if you want. Going back in for 20 minutes, we're taking the lid off, and then we're baking it until it's as golden brown as we like, and the internal temperature should be between 205 and 210 degrees Fahrenheit. There you have it. That is how you make a loaf of sourdough bread in less than 12 hours, including the time it takes to feed your starter. This loaf is lacking a little bit of that sour flavor because we skipped the cold proof, but it's quick and my kids adore it. Let me know if you tried this in the comments.